Happy spring snow day, class. I'm going to finish up the lecture that we started in class on the start of the Cold War. If you remember, we left off discussing the containment policy, which led to the Truman Doctrine, and now we're going to look at the Marshall Plan. One of the worries about the spread of communism was the economic problems in Europe. In France, Italy, and Germany in particular, there was massive economic devastation. This led to fears about the vulnerability of these countries to communism, because there's this idea that communist parties would exploit these economic hardships and take control. So Secretary of State John Marshall convinces Europeans to work out a joint plan for economic recovery. And he promises that the US will offer financial assistance to support this plan. The European countries meet to work out a plan that focuses on rebuilding the economy, which the US hopes will have the long-term goal of economically containing communism. The European countries come up with a plan. It should be noted that the Soviet Union is invited to participate, but ends up leaving. They feel like there are too many harsh conditions, like asking for political reforms, and they decide the whole thing is a capitalist plot and leave. So the Marshall Plan that they come up with is incredibly expensive, and it asks for around $12.5 billion, $13 billion-ish dollars from the US government. And the US is hesitant. This would be a big change in foreign policy. Although they helped for the war, are they willing to pay post-war? But when Czechoslovakia falls to the communist regime, and again, there's that threat that communist is spreading and it must be contained, in this case economically, the US government believes that the financial cost is worth it if it would contain communism, and they will commit the money over 4 years. The Marshall Plan is incredibly successful. Like the Truman Doctrine's success in Turkey and Greece, we will see the Marshall Plan succeed in Europe. Italy in particular will succeed greatly in fighting off communism from this. This whole thing, again, common theme, is a change in US foreign policy, taking a global leadership role. You should also remember that the Soviet Union does not allow any European countries to participate in the Marshall Plan, which leads to a lot of terrible economic hardships in Eastern Europe. I've got, aside from this good-looking picture of George Marshall here, got a map showing US military or economic aid for these various countries. Truman does some other foreign policy and international ideas under his presidency. We will see the creation of Israel, and that is done by the United Nations. There had been call for a Jewish state for a long time, the Jewish homeland where Jerusalem is, and currently the Palestinians live there, but the UN helps create a Jewish state, the State of Israel. It's very controversial. Obviously, most of the Arab countries in the area do not want a Jewish state nearby. Additionally, there are already people living there, the Palestinians. Truman is one of the first, or the first really, to recognize the State of Israel on the first day it's established. He does this for various reasons, guilt from the Holocaust, as well as getting a strong ally in the Middle East, and additionally avoid Israel entangling with the Soviets at all, so establishing US alliance right there. This will lead to long-lasting conflict, and we'll talk more about that as we get further along into the century. But we will see a lot of the Arab nations, hostility towards Israel, and the US gets put in a difficult position, especially when it comes to the issue of oil. Also, some new government organizations created or reorganization. This is where the Department of Defense is created. It's created with the National Security Act. So this will be the establishment of the Pentagon. showing again the US's new priority in military and defense. Additionally, they will create the National Security Council, NSC, to advise the president on security issues, and the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, to collect information around the world. Also, Truman will call back the Selective Service Act. This will be left in place for a few decades, and it'll affect a lot of young men. We'll talk about that more when war starts, particularly Korea and Vietnam, and we'll get to that. Lastly, we see the start of the arms race under Truman. We will see this continue through the various presidents. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests an atomic bomb, which is very threatening to the US. They thought the Soviets were at least 3 years away, which leads to fears about like spies and stuff like that, which we'll get to with McCarthy, but also shows, the Soviets could be a real threat. Truman will push the US to research for an H-bomb. And against the warning of scientists, the H-bomb is successfully tested by the United States. It's about 1,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb. And the Soviet Union will quickly follow, getting a hydrogen bomb as well. And this will really be the start of what we call the nuclear arms race, which will continue throughout the decades, various high points and low points. And it's kind of based on this theory, which we'll talk more about, called MAD, mutually assured destruction, that if both sides have these weapons, they won't dare use them, with the threat being that then it would be used on them. So it's kind of like this idea that peace will be kept through this. The arms race isn't just like a military buildup, but it also is the establishment of really two strong world powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. In Asia, we've got a few events and very different. Japan, if we remember, had surrendered to the United States, and the United States stays in Japan for about 7 years to help it rebuild. The rebuilding takes place under the supervision of General MacArthur. Come back to him with Korea. The U.S. establishes a democracy. We'll continue this trend throughout U.S. history. The U.S. sets up a few democracies. Once they take over areas, we see it in like Iraq and Afghanistan. The rebuilding of Japan goes really well for Japan. It will become an economic powerhouse and an incredibly strong ally of the United States. In China, the Civil War had been raging for a long time, even during World War II, between nationalists and communist forces. Naturally, the U.S. had backed the non-communist side, the nationalist, led by Chiang Kai-shek. However, that's a losing side. Mao will lead the communist forces to victory, and that'll be a real bummer for the U.S. I think once China turns to communist, it's about a quarter of the world's population will now be living under a communist regime. And that's a big threat to the idea of containment and proof that communism is here to spread. It'll lead to a lot of anxiety in the US. Truman gets a lot of blame for this fall, although he says it's not his fault. It will also really amp up the U.S. dedication to containment because there's this fear that communism is spreading. China will ally with the Soviet Union, but it is not a puppet or satellite state. It will keep its independence, unlike a lot of the other nearby communist countries. Vietnam, there's not much to say yet, but it's important to know that the conflict in Vietnam and the U.S. involvement really starts under Truman. So we'll be talking about it for a few decades, but it really starts under Truman. You should know that the U.S. starts to get financially involved. So Vietnam had been a French-controlled colony. France had kind of lost control, and they are hoping to recolonize. Although the U.S. opposes recolonization, we talked about that post-war, they didn't approve of what the Soviet Union's doing. They hate communists more, and the French are fighting against communist forces led by Ho Chi Minh. He's the colonization leader. So the US will kind of start to like half-heartedly support France with some aid. But once China falls and that threat of communism spreading seems worse, the US and Truman will ramp up aid to France. A lot of this is secret and not super public, which we'll come to later. But it's that idea that they need to spend money, they need to get invested in this issue to contain communism. And this involvement goes on for decades. Last thing you should know about is the Korean War. Post-World War II, the Korean War, I don't know if I can get a video to play, it's supposed to show up. The Korean War, not the Korean War, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, and it was communist in the north and democratic in the south. So the 38th parallel is that line, and it's kind of left in that uncertain territory. In 1950, North Korea will invade South Korea. This video in the bottom shows of the troops going in, the North Korean troops invading South Korea. And mute that video. We don't need the action music, but you can kind of watch as the response. So North Korea invades South Korea and takes over most of the country. They do invade with Soviet-made tanks, showing alliance with the Soviet Union. This invasion is seen as proof that communism is expanding and must be contained. Truman will invoke the NSC 68, National Security Council Memorandum number 68, which had been issued previously, but Truman will get it to start. It said that the U.S. will quadruple its defense spending. I think it's about $50 billion a year. This is a really important Cold War document because it changes U.S. policy to promote growth of the military, and it will obviously massively expand the U.S. military. You should be prepared on the AP exam to see military spending charts, particularly from this time period, and understand what events, if you see like a graph, what events increased or decreased that spending. Truman will go to the UN and ask for a change in this fight against communism. He says, we need to push the North Koreans out of South Korea. It's the spread of communism. And he will get the UN to send the largest UN operation. It is technically a UN-led peacekeeping mission, but it has a US general, General MacArthur, fighting mostly with US troops who take orders directly from the US. So technically UN, but very US dominated. MacArthur's troops, and you can see in the graphic that I'll show again, will successfully push the North out of South Korea back to that 38th parallel. But MacArthur will push further into North Korea past the parallel. The UN push into North Korea will lead the Chinese to come in. I think they're called Chinese volunteers, and counterattack, pushing UN troops to retreat back into South Korea, and many die. Then it's kind of unsure what they're going to do with Korea. You can see that the North is pushing on the map back down past the parallel, and it's kind of uncertain what will happen. Truman and MacArthur start fighting. They have very different war strategies, and they kind of fight publicly. Truman wants a limited war, like, okay, we can't take all of North Korea. We need to have specific goals and methods. MacArthur says there's no substitute for victory. He's willing to go as far as using an atomic bomb. When MacArthur crosses the line and starts talking trash about Truman, he will be fired. MacArthur returns home and he's really popular. Like, people still love him. But Truman is able to successfully defend his decision to fire him, which, although Truman doesn't gain popularity from it, does affirm that the civilian or presidential does ultimately have control over the military, control over military leaders like MacArthur, who might have more experience. The Korean War will drag on. I don't know why I put a colon in between there. It will eventually end under Eisenhower. That will be one of his campaign promises that we will talk about later on. I will hopefully see you guys tomorrow.